the South, slaves pressed the issue themselves by running away whenever and however they could. Their stories filled a growing abolitionist press, giving rise to rumors of a vast network for escapees, soon called the Underground Railroad. Part folklore, part propaganda, the Underground Railroad was never as large as we often imagine, but it was real. A loosely organized network of safe houses in the border states helped more than 20,000 runaways make their way to freedom. The network was run by free blacks and sympathetic whites, and it required immense courage from them all. This is one of the few documented safe houses on the Underground Railroad, and the site of at least one remarkable escape.
Mary Corbett heard a knock on the door, and it was an enslaved man who was fleeing, and the sheriff was after him. And he pleaded to her to help him. So she brings him into the house, and they go all the way up to the attic area, and she points to a very, very, very small little door in the eaves and suggests that he try to crawl in there and hide himself. There's a pounding on the door. The sheriff and his posse are with him, and she opens the door and lets them in. And she tells them they're welcome to search any room in the house. Stop, turn around, and here's the cupboard that Sam hid in.
That?
Yes, Mary Corbett brought him up here, and he squeezed himself in there.
My God, it's just so tiny.
And the sheriff decided not to look, because they didn't think that a man could fit in there.
They would have just caught me. I'm too claustrophobic to go in there. I just said, look, let's make a deal.
But if the sheriff is after you with his dogs and guns, you might find a way.
That's incredible. No wonder they didn't look there.
Right.
Amazing. Infuriated by all the runaways, Southerners pushed for harsh laws to staunch the flow, culminating in the notorious Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a watershed moment in American history. The law required Northerners to help capture anyone even accused of being a runaway slave, turning the North into a police power for the South. It also placed every free black person in terrible danger.
Every time you walked on the street, you were subject to being claimed as a slave. You're living every day afraid and watching over your shoulder to make sure that you're not being watched by someone who was looking for you or someone else, and will happily take you if they can't find the someone else.
As bounty hunters flooded northern cities, black people began to look for freedom in ever more distant places. Small numbers have been running away to Canada since the Revolutionary War. Now, they began to come here, to Niagara Falls on the Canadian border, in droves. Why Canada? No slavery. And no slavery meant no slave catchers. In Canada, a black person could serve on a jury. A black person could vote. A black person could own property. A black person could become a citizen. Canada was for black people what the United States was for white people. The land of the free, the home of the brave. Over 10,000 African Americans fled to Canada in the 1850s, including the most well-known conductor of the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman. Tubman settled here in the tiny town of St. Catharines and joined this church, which became a hub for runaways. There are black families still living in this town who trace their roots back to those runaways. People whose ancestors took an almost unimaginable risk.
Here is just one portion of the descendant wall from 1838 all the way to today. So this is portions of the Cassile family. You had to get out of the South, and you were on your own. What did you have? You didn't have a map, you didn't have the education, you had nothing. So you had to be able to rely on the North Star and yourself. I want to point out my immediate family. So this is on my mother's side.
This is the home team.
Yeah, this is my mom's mom. And then bounty hunters are after you. So there was a lot at risk, and not many would do it. And those that did, I mean, it's documented. You had to be a little bit bent.
You had to be, you had to be totally crazy.
Yeah. When I was a youngster, we knew of the stories, but I never appreciated any of it, never looked back or even thought about it until I was grown. And then it's like, my God, my people did that? Mm-hmm. That's how we got here?
The very existence of these families, an entire community of people descended from escaped slaves, is a testament to their strength.
When I think about the Underground Railroad, it makes me want to claim slaves, right, as my ancestors, because they were genius in order to pull something off like this. I think about this and I think, wow, you know, slavery is not a shame on me, because my ancestors were some of the most creative, resourceful people in the history of the United States. That's a shame on the slaveholders, but there's no stigma that I bear by being descended from people who could do something like that, you know, who could pull something like that off.
Unfortunately, the Underground Railroad was out of reach for almost all slaves. Only a fraction ever made it to freedom. Their stories are inspiring, but their experience was not typical. As the Civil War drew near, almost 4 million slaves remained trapped in a nation still struggling to resolve its most fundamental contradictions. Their lives were desperate, and the choices they faced are hard to contemplate. Covington, Kentucky, the northern border of the slaveholding South. In January of 1856, an enslaved woman named Margaret Garner lived here on a farm. Margaret was 22, she was married with 4 children. Freedom lay just 5 miles away, so she and her husband decided to run. They traveled by night and made it here to the banks of the Ohio River at dawn. This was the barrier between slave Kentucky and free Ohio. It was a 1/4 mile wide and frozen solid.
They got here just before sunrise.
So they must have been exhausted and terrified.
And cold.
And cold, yeah.
Yeah.
And they look over there and it's nothing but ice.
Frozen solid.
A natural footbridge.
A natural footbridge to freedom.
The Garners walked across the river, risking their lives with every step. And then they arrived at a small house in Ohio, owned by a free black man. But their triumph was short-lived. Within hours, federal marshals had tracked the family down.
They got a big block of wood and start ramming in the door. They try to go into the windows, and outside a crowd is gathering, just to see this scene taking place. Inside there's mayhem, there's alarm, people are hysterical at the thought that they were so close to freedom and had only enjoyed it for 2 hours. And now, it looks like they're gonna be returned into bondage.
Nightmare.
Yes.
Barricaded in the house, Margaret Garner did something unthinkable.
As the marshals were battering in the house, Margaret Garner decided, rather than return to slavery, she would kill her children.
When the marshals finally broke in, they were confronted by a horrible scene. Margaret had slashed the throat of her daughter Mary. Mary lay on the floor, dead. Hiding in the next room were her 2 young sons, still alive, but bruised and bleeding. Margaret, knife in hand, was quite clear about what she'd done and why.
The only direct quote we have from Margaret Garner about the murder was, she says, "I did the best that a mother could do, and I would have done better and more for the rest. I've done the best I could."
Meaning I would have killed them all
Right.
if I could have.
And for her, she said this to a couple of visitors who saw her when she was in jail, that this was freedom. She called her deceased toddler a bird for having flown into freedom.
Margaret Garner quickly became a legend, celebrated and condemned across the country. What she had done became fodder for both sides of the slavery debate. Southern whites claimed that Margaret showed that black people were subhuman, capable of monstrous deeds, and in need of their master's paternal care. Abolitionists claimed that Margaret revealed the essential inhumanity of bondage.
Margaret Garner stood for powerful ideas, images on all sides, and perhaps not enough for her own side. It's like, I'm not a poster child for abolitionism, and I'm not a defective mother, but I am a woman who knows what it feels like, looks like, means to be a slave, and I don't want that for my children.
Margaret Garner's story had a final tragic turn. An Ohio court ruled that, as a slave, she was property and couldn't be tried for murder. So she was given back to her owner. And here, on a riverboat heading south, Margaret made one last decision about her family. She let her infant daughter, Celia, slip into the icy water and drown.
If Celia had only lived 9 more years, she would have been free. But Margaret couldn't have possibly known that. Margaret preferred to kill her own children rather than to allow them to live the social death of slavery.
It was a horrifying decision, but it tells us something about the America of its time. Slavery was so deeply embedded in the nation that violence seemed the only way to end it. And much more violence was coming.
Funding for the African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross, was made possible by
Senegal, Africa, the door of no return. From these shores, millions of Africans went across oceans and continents, battlefields, racial barriers, and constitutional divides. Bank of America is proud to sponsor Many Rivers to Cross, an epic journey through 500 years.